Hello and welcome to the Progress Theory, where we discuss scientific principles for optimising human performance. I am Dr. Phil Price, and on today's episode, we're joined by physiologist and PhD student Jem Arnold. Now, Jem has an extensive research background, particularly using NIRS, that's Near Infrared Spectroscopy, and he uses that to measure muscle oxygenation. Now, I want to know more about what NIRS does, what it can do, and how we can utilise that information to try and maximise hybrid performance, particularly around muscle oxygenation and saturation. Now we can use that information to inform our programming. As always, follow the Progress Theory on Instagram and YouTube and check out all of our other content. Here is Jem Arnold. Jem, thank you so much for coming on to the Progress Theory podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Thanks for the invite.
Not a problem. I first heard of your work through Sean Seal on the Upside Strength podcast. And I know you've done quite a few things with him, particularly, I know he's been populating a lot of his stuff because obviously he does stuff in French, stuff in English, and he's created his own English channel. And your work where you went through some data using NIRS on a step test or ramp test came up, and I was like, oh, and that's on the save to watch again. I watched it probably about 6 months ago when just refreshing my memory on certain different opinions on NIRS data and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, okay, brilliant. I'll definitely listen to that again. And then I was like, wait a minute, why don't you bring on my podcast? I've got questions that I want to ask. So thank you so much for coming on. Very selfish of me for asking you on. This is one I've been looking forward to.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it was a great couple conversations with Sean. Same as kind of this will probably be is just kind of going here and there with ideas. And, we're kind of all figuring it out as we go in terms of how to interpret NIRS in particular and all the rest of my work. So yeah, happy to go down whatever rabbit holes we end up here.
No, brilliant. Well, to start off, do you want to tell a little bit about yourself and where your research started and where it's sort of heading?
So my name's Jem. I'm a physiotherapist and PhD candidate right now at University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. The PhD is focused on endurance athletes, mostly cyclists with a particular vascular condition. So it's kind of this combination between clinical and high performance where we have this vascular disease or vascular condition that's impairing their performance and their health, but it's only occurring in this highly trained population. So it's kind of an interesting balance there. And of course, kind of combines, again, the clinical and performance side of my interests, where we can learn lessons from this population and hopefully extrapolate it to, in one direction to the performance side, to the athletes, and the other direction to the patients. I'm a few years into that PhD. It's rolling along. There's maybe one more experiment to go. I was just telling you, I had an email this morning that one of my papers got accepted. So that's great. It'll be published soon. That was on NIRS. We can maybe talk about that in particular or talk about NIRS in general. And that's kind of the other part of my research is generally on individual variability, I guess, or individual responses to training. A lot of the work that I do uses NIRS, Near Infrared Spectroscopy. We can get into the details, but I know you've talked about that before with some of your past guests. And it's a great tool because we're using it in real world situations in the field, literally in the field, on the road, or in the laboratory. And it's kind of giving us equally valuable information in both of those contexts to understand an individual response to training or exercise, whatever the case is. And then I've done some work with a colleague of mine, Dr. Michael Rosenblatt, who's in Toronto, and his expertise is on meta-analyses and looking at training interventions and different things about, periodization models and different interval types. So with him, I've kind of joined that. And again, we're looking at, reviewing the literature and what can we say about the effectiveness of different training interventions, how to program those interventions. And then within these data sets, we're starting to be able to extract more information about the individual athlete response rather than just the group level research, which is, of course, what most of the research is in sports science. But when we want to apply that research, we're applying it to an individual athlete. So that's kind of a general overview. We said, again, I kind of dabble in a lot of different things in my research career so far, very early in that career. So we'll see where the conversation goes.
Yeah, exciting. There's so much to unpick there. Your current PhD regarding the vascular disease, regarding the iliac artery. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, like blood flow limitations in the iliac artery, phlia for short, or endofibrosis is another term that is out there in the literature.
What are the negative symptoms from that can lead to, being the athlete being very ill?
Yeah, it's this frustrating condition that it's kind of a very gradual onset over time where you get a compression or a kink of the iliac artery. And the iliac artery is the main artery that feeds blood to our legs. We're kind of still up in the pelvis, so we're not even down into the leg and the femoral artery, but the iliac artery becomes the femoral artery. So if you can imagine, it affects cyclists predominantly because the position we're in, right, that kind of hunched forward aerodynamic position, each pedal stroke, or in runners, each stride, or in skaters and rowers, some of these other endurance athletes that it does affect, we're compressing and potentially stretching that artery so that we're just acutely limiting blood flow. Of course, if we're limiting blood flow to the legs during exercise and our demand for energy is super elevated, we're going to run into a limitation where we can no longer deliver the blood flow and the oxygen to support that level of metabolic activity, metabolic demand. It kind of feels similar to what high intensity exercise feels like. So it's that kind of burning pain, tightness, heaviness in the legs. But because, of course, this is happening earlier, it's happening prematurely during exercise, it becomes much more severe. We're talking about, quite debilitating pain during exercise in the working muscles, in the quadriceps, in the legs. And of course, you get a loss of power in one leg primarily. It's actually usually a unilateral condition. So it kind of leads to all of these other presentations, biomechanical asymmetries and all kinds of weird stuff. And because these are healthy athletes, we're not expecting to see a vascular disease, a vascular condition. So, they'll present to a physiotherapist or present to a sports med doc with kind of ambiguous, non-specific pain. My left leg is really burning when I'm doing my VO2 max efforts. And it's kind of like, yeah, that sounds totally normal. So it's hard to kind of identify when, where this tipping point is between normal, expected exertional discomfort and when that becomes pathological pain. And that kind of tells us where this ischemia, this blood flow limitation, this oxygen delivery limitation is becoming a pathological limitation to performance. So confusing, academically fascinating, have to say. And maybe I'll mention, I have this condition myself. So, I come from a place of understanding and love when I say, it's a fascinating condition. It sucks for the athletes who have it. It's, again, very uncomfortable and distressing because we don't know what's causing these symptoms. Yeah, there's a lot that we're trying to understand and really progress the understanding of the condition.
Was having the condition what led you to do your PhD in this? Because my PhD is in the knee and I had crappy knees. So that made me want to learn more about the knee to try and figure out why my knees were crappy. So it was a similar thing for you.
That's exactly right. Yeah, like in physio school, we kind of joke that, we're all a bunch of washed up athletes who have had all of the injuries under the sun, and that's kind of our on-ramp into learning what a physio is in the first place and wanting to become that, wanting to deal with other athletes and try to help other athletes through these injuries that we've experienced ourselves. And so it's the exact same thing with this condition. Is I went through the difficult process of learning about this in the first place. And again, I had this, I developed this. It's I think I mentioned, right? It kind of progresses over the course of years, so it can be quite slow to appear. I was a physio, and I was like, this is easy. This is something I can fix, just some asymmetry, and it just wasn't responding to anything. So it was that kind of pursuit of trying to understand why I wasn't responding to the training that I was also giving to other athletes, and they were responding great. That kind of led me back into research in the first place, right? Back from the clinic into the laboratory. And in fact, literally in our university, the clinic is on the main floor and the laboratory is above it on the second floor. So I kind of have just moved from ground floor up to the second floor. But yeah, it's certainly inspiring to try to help other athletes go through this. And I think that, again, gives me kind of maybe an extra bit of empathy and understanding when they are going through this process and trying to understand it themselves. So that was a really important part of why I chose to do the PhD in this, and that is certainly motivating me through the long process of getting the PhD.
Yeah, certainly.
Long and rewarding process. Let's say that.
Definitely. I definitely know how long my PhD took me 5 years, and very rewarding now I've done it. But at the time I could feel the length of it. Which sport, were you a cyclist, which led to the onset of this particular disease? Because I wanted to ask, do you think this is more common in cyclists because they are spending such a long time in that closed hip position where you said about skaters, runners, even though they're doing high volumes, there's probably more chance they're going to move around a little bit just because they're not constrained by the bike in a way.
Right. That's exactly what we think. And yeah, I was a very mediocre cyclist. In my particular story, we were chatting just before, right? I played rugby in high school and university, and that's where I managed to get all of my accumulated injuries that led me into the interest in physiotherapy. And I also think that injury history had something to do in my case with, again, we're thinking about kind of a muscular compression on that artery. So the injuries that I had in that area were compressing the artery once I began my mediocre cycling career. So there's a lot about the risk factors and the contributing factors that we don't fully understand, which is quite frustrating, but we're making progress on that. The main reason, as you implied, that we think it affects, or it does seem to affect cyclists predominantly, is that aerodynamic hip flexed position. Just it's this kind of magic, unfortunate combination of external mechanical forces on the artery related to that bent forward position, combined with, these are very fit athletes. So combined with this large volume of blood flow that's trying to push through that artery on every pedal stroke. And it's this kind of combination of external and internal forces that lead the artery itself to pathologically remodel under those stresses to try to accommodate for those stresses, but it ends up becoming thicker, narrower. A narrower pipe is going to be able to carry less blood flow. So it's kind of progressively worsening over time. But we do see it in other sports, in runners, right? And in field sports as well. The rugby players, there's been case studies with this condition. So it's not the hip flex, the aerodynamic, the racing position is not necessary because we can have these athletes in an upright position who also develop it. But we suspect it's a similar mechanism where we're still getting, repeated, vigorous contraction of the muscles around the hips and pelvis, which are compressing those arteries. And in running, for example, there may be even a component of, rather than flex forward and compressed, you're more upright, you're getting big, long strides. You might actually be stretching and then kind of recovering the artery. So maybe instead of a compressive, it's more of a stretching tension. Very speculative at this point. But maybe one more thing important to note is it does seem to really exclusively affect athletes above a certain training level, above a certain fitness level. It's really the most fit athletes. It's most often identified in, professional cyclists. It certainly appears in amateurs, and it's usually, more competitive amateurs. Certainly appears in less trained, but just the predominance of presentation. It's almost like you need a certain minimum level of fitness, as I said, to drive that very high hemodynamic blood flow load, right? If I'm untrained, I'm not going to be able to impose a metabolic demand on myself such that my heart is able to or needs to push that amount of blood through that artery. So the artery only becomes limiting when an athlete has kind of reached a certain level of fitness. So that's a good thing because it means not every cyclist, not every endurance athlete should be concerned about developing this. It's very uncommon. We speculate that potentially professional cycling, again, as kind of the highest cohort, the diagnostic or the presentation rates might be as high as 20% of professionals. In amateurs, it's going to be much, much lower than that. I couldn't give you an exact number, but much, much lower than that. So it's certainly not our first differential diagnosis when, again, when an athlete walks into a clinic and says, hey, my legs are burning am I doing my VO2 max work? There's other much more common things that we should be interested in looking for, but this is kind of just, a little bit further down the list in those endurance athletes.
For this research, I'm assuming you're using NIRS. For those that are listening that are not too familiar with NIRS, how does it work? And then because you're in that sort of flexed over aerodynamic position, is it quite hard to locate the iliac artery with the NIRS device? Just because of positional reason, and one of the reasons why you have to do a number of studies before looking at the more practical studies to make sure that what you're measuring is actually what you want to measure.
Yeah, totally. So to give a kind of a brief summary of NIRS, Near Infrared Spectroscopy. So we're using a little device, we're using wearable devices. So these are, the size of maybe a little bit bigger than your Apple Watch or your Garmin watch. And it's placed just directly on the skin over the muscle, right? The vastus lateralis is usually the muscle of interest in cycling, and it's shining a light into the tissue. So very similar to your Garmin or Apple Watch, your sport watch. That's shining a light into the tissue, and it's measuring heart rate from that, and it might be measuring arterial oxygen saturation. So that's how much of the hemoglobin and red blood cells in your blood, in your arterial blood, is saturated with oxygen. And that number is going to be somewhere close to 100%. In most cases, right at sea level, at rest or during exercise, our arterial oxygen saturation is going to be pretty close to 100%. Unless we're at altitude, for example, then, right, these devices can be used to detect if that number is getting too low. Maybe it's getting down into the low 90s or even the high 80s. And if it's ever really below that, there might be something wrong. It's in a hospital situation, right, they'll put the little finger clip on, which is measuring that SMO₂, that arterial oxygen saturation, and low numbers are bad. With muscle oxygenation, with NIRS, similar technology, but that light is going a little bit deeper into the tissue, and it's looking at the muscle itself. And so it's giving us more information about the balance of oxygen coming in, oxygen delivery, and oxygen uptake by the muscles, by the mitochondria. For example, at rest, just to give a sense of kind of the dynamic range, at rest, maybe the number's 60% in most people. There's a big individual variability. We can talk about that. That's part of my research, but let's just keep it simple and say most people are going to be somewhere around 60% at rest. When we start exercising, and as exercise intensity goes up, we're going to be extracting more oxygen from that muscle that we're illuminating, that we're measuring from. We're extracting more oxygen. We will be delivering more oxygen. So kind of both of those rates will increase. But the extraction, of course, as intensity goes up, kind of increases faster than the delivery. And of course, at some point, we reach our limit. We reach our VO2 max. We reach our maximal metabolic steady state. And so at that point, we might have gone from 60% maybe down to 30% or even down to 0%, close to 0%. Those numbers they depend on different individuals. They depend on different NIRS devices. But basically, with higher exercise intensity, this SMO₂ number, this muscle oxygen saturation number, tends to go down. And it reaches our minimum value at maximum exercise tolerance. So you can imagine, whether we're thinking about a clinical context or a performance context, this thing is super interesting to look at during exercise. Because again, we can put it on with an athlete out in the field, out on the road, or in a laboratory, in a clinic, and we're getting some information about locally what's happening in the muscle. So if an athlete has an injury, right, a knee injury, an ACL, we can look at the muscles around that joint, around that injury, and see what are they doing. Are they able to extract the oxygen and produce the energy to contract as well as we want them to be able to? Or if we think about a flow limitation, right, and I'm measuring in the quadricep, so we're not looking at the iliac artery because, as you suggested, the iliac artery, it's quite deep. It's like deep inside our pelvis. So it's more about looking at the downstream consequences in the muscle as a result of when blood flow becomes limiting in the artery. So we can see as intensity increases, right, and we kind of our delivery, our oxygen delivery, our blood flow starts to reach that structural limit, that pathological limit of this flow limitation. Then what we might expect to see is that, we're still producing work, we're still extracting as much energy as we can from the oxygen that we have available, but now we have less coming in, and so we start to get this, deoxygenation and this desaturation, and that coincides with the appearance of symptoms of that pain and burning, and of course, just a loss of power in that limb. We're using it, it's kind of downstream consequences of the flow limitation. We're not imaging the iliac artery itself, but we are using this diagnostically even at an earlier point of detection, right? Because this can be used outside of a specialist clinic environment, we can use this at an earlier point to maybe just raise a yellow flag in case we are starting to suspect a flow limitation. And we've had a study published, was it 2022, a couple of years ago anyways, at this point, from my work with my colleagues in the Netherlands, using these devices and showing that it does improve the diagnostic sensitivity in this condition. So again, using NIRS in this clinical context, this very specific clinical context, is kind of helping us to understand, in healthy athletes, we are also going to see an oxygen delivery limitation at some point, at VO2 max. By definition, we've reached an oxygen delivery limitation. So using this specific clinical context, we're understanding a bit more to be able to apply it in a performance context.
And I remember you saying that usually this happens more on one side than the other. Is it a rapid desaturation because they don't not getting the O2 delivery as much because of the restriction further up? So the muscle that's there is the oxygen that's there is getting utilized earlier. Do you see a rapid decline earlier, or is it just faster, or is it just happens at lower intensities?
Yeah, this is part of maybe the difficulty in interpreting the signal, because in a vacuum, if there's less supply coming in and the demand is the same, then we're going to deoxygenate rapidly. But our bodies are really good at compensating. And so we usually don't see a rapid deoxygenation, because as we're kind of getting closer to that limitation, our body is accommodating, even shifting how much power is being produced between one leg and another. On the bike, we can measure this directly with a left-right power balance from a power meter. So we can see if both legs are symmetrical at low intensity, then we might see this diverging trend where the affected leg just gradually begins to produce less, right? It's if the incremental workload is going up and both legs start at 50-50, and maybe by the end, we start to see potentially a large difference in power output. So there's this compensation over time that washes out, that mitigates a little bit of that obvious deoxygenation signal. So a lot of my work is looking at, we kind of have to look at both legs bilaterally at the same time to understand. If we only have a lamp post looking at one leg, and then we only know what's going on in that one leg, but everything else around it, everything else in the body might be changing to compensate and to contribute to the effort. And I think there's probably a lesson there for healthy athletes in a performance context, where at submaximal intensities, our body is very good at adjusting and accommodating and compensating just to meet the effort. And we when there's a reserve in the system at submaximal intensity, we have no problem matching the effort. And we might see all kinds of little asymmetries here and there. It's when we get up to higher intensities where now our body has to bring on board, all of our resources. It kind of has to recruit everything to try to meet the demands of that task. And at that point, if we see, and I call it a divergence, right? If we see kind of a left-right balance diverge, or we see strength deficits or power deficits or whatever it is diverge between the muscles that we're interested in, whatever those muscles are, that can be suggestive of more of an impairment in that muscle. Or for example, and this gets into something that maybe we'll get a chance to talk about, like the hybrid athlete side of things, is going from a lower body predominant task, running, rowing, whatever it is, immediately into a upper body predominant task. And just the kind of compensation that our bodies and our muscles has to do in terms of driving resources to the muscles that need it. And then all of a sudden we change the muscles that we're using, and our body is a little bit slow to make that compensation. And so we can kind of prematurely limit ourselves with that shift. But that's kind of maybe another conversation. So with NIRS, at least, it allows us to look directly at the local tissue that is affected or that we're interested in, but also other tissue systemically around the body. So for example, one of the studies in my PhD that I said, I just got an email this morning that was accepted for publication, so that's great. We looked at 4 different muscle sites, and we actually looked bilaterally at 4 different muscle sites. So we had the vastus lateralis, kind of the prime quadricep muscle during cycling. We had the rectus femoris. RF is a bit more active in running. So running, we consider the primary muscle RF. Cycling, it's VL, small differences. We also look up the chain at the lumbar paraspinal muscles, kind of the lower back muscles, which are, as stabilizer muscles. There's some interesting stuff happening back there, which we still don't fully understand because there's no research back in the paraspinals in cycling. And then we had a deltoid muscle as well as kind of a least involved, about as non-involved a muscle as you're going to find in cycling is the deltoid. And so we can see kind of different things. Okay, what's happening in those prime movers where all of the metabolic activity is happening there, and our body is driving everything, all of the resources it can to those VL and RF. And then the stabilizers still need to be working, right? So there's got to be some kind of a prioritization of those stabilizer muscles. That's where we stabilize our trunk to produce power, to produce torque and leverage to push on the pedals. And meanwhile, that deltoid, again, it's still working. There's still some stabilization of the upper body, but it's probably the lowest priority. And so we see that resources, blood flow is directed away from that muscle during exercise because it's prioritizing those other muscles first. So yeah, lots of interesting implications there.
Yeah, certainly. There's a lot there. That was really, really good. I noticed that when we started emailing to set up this episode, and I mentioned that it'd be great to talk about the use of NIRS, hybrid training, concurrent training, all of that type of thing. You mentioned that, and I think this is linked to your work regarding sort of individual variation versus sort of studies which, utilize the results from a group and then tries to imply that onto an individual. It doesn't always quite work. What are the positives of utilizing, say, NIRS for a hybrid athlete? I know it's something that Sean Seal has used with some of his CrossFit athletes. And what are some of the limitations, or certainly some of the individual variations that we should be aware of if we are trying to use this data to make programming decisions? Sorry, that was a big question. There's a lot there.
Yeah, no, it's good though. So I'm not an expert in hybrid training from a literature perspective, so I can only speculate, but we can kind of think about, what are the strengths and limitations of NIRS.
Speculating's good.
Totally. That's what podcasts are for, is we get to just speculate and have wild ideas and brainstorm.
Exactly.
I think one of the biggest things is the most kind of promising to me is, and I kind of brought it up before, is this idea that we can look at different local tissues to understand how this metabolic demand is distributed around the body during different tasks and during a different sequence of tasks. So again, high rocks or CrossFit, where we have this kind of circuit of potentially very different task demands immediately following one another, where we have to not just balance not just maximize how hard we can go on any one of them, because we have to kind of pace ourselves, right, across all of the different demands. And if we have a different limiting factor in one versus another, so I said, right, a lower body or an endurance activity, right, in high rocks, I don't know, you go for a run and then you throw a ball against a wall, something like that, I've been told. So there's this very different demands between running full body, but of course more lower extremity muscles being used, and then wall ball, which is again systemic, but there's a lot more recruitment of the upper body, of the arms. Being able to have NIRS sensors on both of those locations and understand, okay, we can see what's going on during running, we can see to both muscles, right? So here, I'll step back and we can kind of go through it. So I mentioned in our study, right, we were looking at the deltoid muscle during cycling, which is a quote unquote non-involved or a least involved muscle site. So in running, it would be fairly similar. And what we see in general is the most metabolically active tissues are going to be where the body is directing more of its resources, blood flow predominantly. And there's a very clever mechanisms of how we kind of manage blood flow so that it gets to where it needs to go. It gets to the brain, the heart, the respiratory muscles, and then the skeletal muscles, whichever skeletal muscles are most active. And if we go from particularly running, where legs are working, right, large muscle mass in the lower body, so we get a large volume of blood directed to those muscles, and it's going down, it's flowing down towards our feet against gravity, and so now we have to push that blood back up towards the rest of the body. Totally fine when we're running because we have that muscle pump effect, right? As we're going, every stride, every muscle contraction helps to pump blood back through the veins up to the rest of the body, up to the heart. Then we go to a wall ball situation where we have less engagement, less recruitment of the lower body, more recruitment of the upper body. And now we have to shift and get all of that blood flow that's been directed to our legs up to our upper body. So what we might expect to see, for example, during that run, if we're measuring at the bicep or the deltoid or the shoulder, wherever, we might see that site constrict, vasoconstrict, as in blood flow is being directed away from it. And we infer that there's vasoconstriction because we would see deoxygenation happening in those non-involved muscles, again, least involved muscles. So if there's deoxygenation happening, either the muscle has to be recruited more, extracting more oxygen, or there has to be less delivering less oxygen at the same kind of metabolic demand. And we can experiment, and we have experimented, in cycling, it's quite easy. You can basically have someone immobilize their upper limb, so there's really no muscle engagement, and we still see that deoxygenation. So in a run, when there's more activity of the upper body, there's going to be some recruitment. That's totally fair. But we also know in the background, we're kind of seeing that restriction and that vasoconstriction happening to those upper body muscles. So, we'll see some deoxygenation in the arm during that run. If we push that run too hard, we have, kind of too much deoxygenation in the upper body and the lower body. And now we have to change tasks and we have to start to use the upper body, and that upper body is constricted. Now we're going to start to see that limitation where on the first throw, right, or the first task, whatever the event is, as soon as we get that muscle recruitment and oxygen extraction, then we really see that deoxygenation dive down. So that balance of different sites during different tasks, in theory, again, speculative here, but may allow us to pace all of these events better and kind of understand where our strengths and our limiters are, not just from a strength perspective, which, again, your expertise probably is much more on that side than mine, but on the endurance and the combination and the sequence of tasks, which is more about the metabolic side of things.
Say, using your example, I'll swap out wall balls for a ski erg, just because I know your legs are mainly sort of stationary as you're pulling it down. Say you were quite poor, like say you're really desaturated from the run, you've gone out too hot, and you see sort of desaturation or lower muscle oxygenation up in the upper body that hadn't been working as like the lower body has, and all of a sudden they've got to be utilized in the ski erg. Now I start doing the ski erg. What would that muscle O2 saturation look like? Would it just completely dive bomb? It would start from like a lower baseline and completely dive bomb, or would it just remain sort of constant, like it's not, the utilization hasn't really been utilized as well as it should be type thing? What kind of thing do you think you would see?
Rather than thinking about the value, the percent value, we can think about the trend. We can think about the slope, the rate of change of this SMO₂ value over time. At rest, of course, right, we kind of, the line will be fairly constant, and that's telling us that the delivery of oxygen is more or less equal to the rate of extraction. So we're kind of seeing this flux. We're seeing the balance of delivery and extraction. And right, as we work harder, as we extract more, we're going to start to see that line go down. So deoxygenation basically tells us that our rate of extraction is greater than our rate of delivery. And so the steeper downward that line goes. So again, if we've just overcooked our run, we're starting the ski erg, we're starting from a lower value. And of course, that's important because our minimum is our minimum. So we kind of have less functional range to use. But we're also going to see a steeper deoxygenation because we've constricted the supply side, and now we've all of a sudden increased the extraction side. So our extraction is now much, much greater than our rate of delivery, meaning that deoxygenation slope is very, very steep downward. So again, not only are we starting from a lower value and we have less functional range before we reach our minimum value, whatever that minimum value is, but we're going to reach it quicker because that flux rate because we have not allowed ourselves to kind of balance that flux of oxygen and blood flow coming in and oxygen and energy being extracted. So that's probably the biggest thing, is on any kind of task, if we're seeing kind of the first 1, 2, 3 reps and we're already deoxygenating super steep and we're kind of going to reach our limit soon, that probably means we've overcooked it. And at that point, there's not much that we can do other than just reduce the workload, and we really have to pull back. And if we can pull back earlier, and if we can kind of like, okay, I've overcooked it, I really got to reduce the pace that I'm doing this event because I know I'm going to reach my task failure earlier. If we can pull back earlier and reduce how steep that line is, it's going to be better overall than if we just kind of go all out, reach the minimum, and now we're just going to blow up. So, it's always better to kind of, hedge a little bit earlier, avoid blowing up, because once we've blown up, it's very hard to come back. It's this idea of hysteresis, like a piece of metal that you can kind of bend and it'll reform back into its normal shape. And if you then bend it too far, it stays bent, and it's much harder to get it back into its normal shape. The same thing happens biologically, where we can push ourselves a little bit and we can come back to our homeostasis. If we push ourselves too far, once we're kind of beyond that tipping point, it's very hard to return to homeostasis. So it's this coming up to a point from below. It can be much different than trying to get back down below that point from above, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Using those trends, so if the slope of the SMO₂ value is sort of like going in an upward direction, that means the amount of O2 that's being delivered is kind of greater than the what's being utilized. If it's flat, that means that both of them are kind of the same. And then if the slope is going downwards, extraction is way higher than the amount of oxygen that's being delivered to the muscle.
Exactly.
Utilizing kind of that as an overview, is that really handy for monitoring either cycling or any type of hybrid kind of combination? Utilizing that, would we be able to understand what's happening to athletes? So then NIRS becomes a very good monitoring tool in the event.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. Well, actually, there's that question of, how many gadgets do we use during an event versus how many gadgets do we use during training? That's a whole other conversation. But my personal philosophy is I tend to use more during training and less during the event. But that's another thing we can get into. But yeah, you're right. During training, let's talk about it. We can kind of monitor that, and different devices have, again, different ways of kind of showing the data and showing us these trends. Some have color coding, some it's just a raw number that you look at. We've used all kinds of different devices. I'm looking, I have a Moxy here beside me, but we've used all kinds of different devices, Moxy, TrainRed, Artenis, and they all have slightly different ways of showing the data. So that's one important thing to consider is which device are we looking at? Because some of the lessons online using one device, for example, my conversations with Sean, were about Moxy, and some of the trends that we see in Moxy absolutely do not, unfortunately, translate to the other NIRS devices just because they're, different designs. So in general, though, that lesson holds true of kind of the trend and the slope of the line tells us something about this balance of oxygen delivery, oxygen extraction. So that is something that we can more reliably use, I would say, more universally use in training, to kind of just have this real-time feedback of what that balance is. Yeah, in particular, the SMO₂ value might be completely different between different individuals. So, in fact, let me highlight that point even stronger, because there is research and there's lots of lessons out there that refer to NIRS values, SMO₂ values, as in, I said it at the start, right? 60%, everybody's around 60% at rest. And that might be true, but there's a large variability in those values. Let's say plus minus 10% on any given day. And that's, in myself, right? Putting a sensor on any given day, I might be anywhere between 50 and 70%. And that's just at rest, never mind during exercise. For example, with Moxy, it's designed its device so that you can reach near 0%, whereas a TrainRed device or some of the other NIRS devices, you'll never see 0%. So it's very hard to translate the values. But if we're looking at the direction of the slope, that's a more consistent measurement that we can use.
I mean, I kind of mentioned it as a bit of a monitoring tool, but what kind of decisions would you utilize let's say TrainRed? How would you utilize that to make training decisions for someone, let's say, that is doing a high rocks, for example? If we're going to go down the speculating route, like what kind of decisions would you utilize the Moxy or the TrainRed to then alter training?
I think the first thing that I want to know is, where are we putting the sensor on? So let's put a sensor on the VL, lower body muscle, and bicep, I guess, as an upper body muscle. So we have kind of two different sites that we have to think about independently, right? They're going to show us different things. They're going to show us what is happening in that local tissue during the different tasks. So then we can really start to understand what's going on systemically. But in general, I want to have a sense of what is this athlete's and this location's physiological range to the data. So again, is it 0 to 70? Is it 40 to 60? When they're at absolute minimum, what do they reach? When they're at absolute maximum, what do they reach? In research, what we would do is if we're measuring a limb, we would apply an occlusion. We would apply a big blood pressure cuff around the arm or the leg and fully occlude and wait until that, basically if we turn the oxygen delivery hose to 0, then we see that deoxygenation and we'll see where it reaches an absolute minimum. So that's nice. Of course, that's not something that we do in an everyday training environment. So then we start to think about, okay, what is the functional range? And a functional range is going to be, again, dependent on the location and dependent on the task. So if the athlete is running, I want to know what is their functional range in the VL when they're running. And so that probably looks like doing an incremental test, treadmill test, right from low to maximum intensity, and just see kind of where they end up at the end of that maximal intensity bout. So that gives us a bit of a framework to then understand when you're running in an event or in training, where are we on that functional range? If we kind of know, okay, at minimum, you're going to be somewhere around, again, make up a number, 30%. Plus minus 5, right? There's always variability. If you go start your run and you see that initial deoxygenation and you're kind of already down to, 40%, right? And there's kind of not much headroom to go, not much dynamic range to go, then we know we start to have to kind of pull back and just kind of play with things. Of course, I never want to make those decisions in a vacuum. So obviously sensations and the patient's or the athlete's report is, to me, always more important than what the data are showing. So again, the data can show, oh wow, you're almost at minimum already. But the next question is, how are you feeling? Oh yeah, I feel fine, no problem. Okay, well let's keep going and see what happens. Or yeah, okay, I feel like crap. Let's kind of just pull back and again try to resist getting too deep into that hole. And then it gives us kind of permission, or it lets us learn, okay, what are the data showing and how well do those data correlate to the sensations, to the subjective report, to how I'm feeling? And as I said, that's what we're doing in training. And then we can kind of take those lessons and take those sensory cues into an event environment where we don't have to look at the data, right? There's all kinds of, some athletes are really, can be stressed out by looking at their heart rate, right? If your heart rate is jacked up because it's a race day and of course it's going to be, you can kind of get worried about your pacing. So we kind of focus on sensations during the race, but in training, using the data and using the subjective or the qualitative sensations allows us just to kind of calibrate. And again, we're just understanding like, all right, what does that range of the NIRS data mean? But also, what does it mean in terms of our sensations when we're down here? What are the range of potential sensations when we're near our minimum? And that's kind of those sensations that I should probably watch out for. What are those sensations when we're really fresh and ready to go and we've had a good session? So I can cue those sensations to say, okay, if we're feeling like this, maybe we can push it a little bit. So does that kind of start to get in more philosophy than a really hard applied lesson here? But does that start to make sense?
Yeah, certainly. And I think that's really nice because one of the key things that I think you've highlighted really well here is that there's a lot of individual variability. And if you want to provide a bit more context to the data that you're getting, you're going to have to get some additional information, whether there's subjective data that provides descriptors. So it sounds like, you're asking questions to get information from the athlete at the right times during their, incremental step test or whatever it might be, because that's adding to the NIRS data to provide better information so you can make decisions. That's not to say NIRS on its own is bad. It's just that because there's a lot of variability, you need a bit more to make sense of that data.
It's more data, and then we have to understand the context around where that data is coming from to turn that data into information. And then that information allows us to understand how do we apply that information, again, in the athlete's training or in their racing events. But I love all the gadgets. I'm a big fan of collecting data and just looking at how things are responding, because the more things we can measure, biology is complicated. The more data points we have, I think, lets us, again, maybe it doesn't give us any like immediately applicable information, but it just lets us kind of ask questions and understand what are the range of potential responses, whether it's lactate, whether it's NIRS, even heart rate, power, all the rest of it. EMG, there's wearable EMG sensors out that are becoming more available, which I'm really interested to see eventually as they make their way into the gym and into strength training and hybrid training. But data are great, but we need that interpretation to turn that data into information.
What kind of changes would you expect to see with the NIRS data plus the subjective data as someone gets better at their sport? And we can apply that to hybrid or to cycling. But what with your coaching and the stuff that you've done, what do you commonly see that people subjectively say along with their NIRS data initially, and then as they get fitter over, a season, all of a sudden it looks very different, and their subjective information is very different alongside that as well?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think it's so important to remember, or to recognize, when are we talking about cross-sectional comparisons, as in we're comparing you versus me versus the next athlete. And we touched on that when we're talking about, group research versus individual application. In group research, we are usually taking two groups of different athletes, or whatever the case is, and we're comparing those athletes. But looking at longitudinal change within an individual can be very different than cross-sectional between individuals. So again, your and my NIRS SMO₂ values can be very different, just like our VO2 max is going to be different, just like our heart rate is going to be different, just like our shoe size is going to be different. We want to know, how does that shoe size change over time in each one of us, right? We want to know, as you're asking, how is NIRS changing over time? And what does that tell us about how performance, can we predict from the NIRS data how performance is going to change over time? Maybe let me talk about cycling, because my colleague, Dr. Asaf Yogav, is hopefully just about to publish the last paper of his PhD, which was a meta-analysis looking at basically exactly what you're asking, looking at what is the change in NIRS after a training intervention, where we looked at studies. I'm remembering off the top of my head here. So there was 3 or 4 or 5 studies, like not a huge body of literature looking at this in the first place. But we looked at those studies, and these are all athletes performing some period of training intervention, runners and cyclists, I believe it was. And they have NIRS data during an incremental test, a ramp test, at the start and at the end. So we have that longitudinal change within each of those athletes. So as I said, during a ramp test, an incremental test, cycling, running, more or less the same, we'll kind of see the minimum SMO₂ value will occur at the end of the test, will be associated with maximum exercise tolerance, because that kind of represents when we're at both the maximal oxygen flux, the maximal rate of delivery and extraction, and we've also extracted all of the reserves that we had. So that saturation, we've pulled everything that we can from it, and now we can't maintain the continued workload, and so that's task failure. That's as far as we can go. So it's a really nice number to have. Even considering the variability in those numbers, and again, we have to think about kind of a plus minus 5-10% where that minimum SMO₂ value might change. We looked at the pre to post change, and what we saw was the value doesn't change, or at least indetectably so. So when we're looking at the NIRS SMO₂ value, we might not actually be looking for a change in the minimum. But what happened after training was, of course, as we would hope, these athletes got fitter. So either, and it depended on the study, and just remembering, either VO2 max improved or some measure of, it was actually watt max, it was actually peak power at the end of a ramp test, which makes sense, right? If we do a pre-test and then we do a training intervention, we hope we see a little bit higher power output at the end of that same ramp test after that training. So their watt peak improved significantly and meaningfully. Don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but significant and meaningful, that's always good to see, both of those. But the SMO₂ value at the end of the test did not increase. But of course, if they reached a higher power, it means it took them longer to get to that minimum SMO₂ value. So that brings us back to that idea of the rate of change and the slope and the relative balance of delivery and extraction. So if we looked at any one submaximal workload, So if an athlete reached 400 watts at the end of the test, if we looked at 200 watts, we would probably see that their SMO₂ value was a little bit higher in the post-test versus the pre-test, indicating there's probably about the same VO2, the same systemic VO2 at that point, right? Because the power is the power. You have to kind of produce the amount of energy to meet that demand. And we would suspect in the muscle itself, where we're measuring with NIRS, it's also probably about the same rate of delivery and extraction. But it represents a lower submaximal demand, such that we're having an easier ability to match supply to demand, and so our SMO₂ value is higher. Did that make sense, that explanation? Right?
Yeah,
longer
certainly.
test, slower to deoxygenate, meaning any one submaximal level, the body is just having an easier time producing that workload.
Yes, certainly. That makes complete sense. I thought there might be some additional testing data that you need, maybe some performance metrics, and then it's how the trend of the SMO₂ values have got there to achieve that new performance metric is what's giving you the information regarding what's happening in the muscle systemically. I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm surprised there's only like 5 studies that have done something. I mean, I know that NIRS devices I know NIRS devices have increased in availability. Now you've got Moxy, you've got TrainRed, and devices that are like recording it at 100 hertz are now being more readily available, in so people can use it, and that's much better for data collection rather than someone at 1 hertz. So data is probably available, but the studies have yet to be done, or certainly in a large amount. So it would be interesting what happens in the next 5 years.
Yeah, interpreting those data is still a challenge.
That's why it's great you're doing your PhD, and you have many different hats utilizing NIRS, because otherwise, we wouldn't know all this great information.
Yeah, there's lots of low-hanging fruit that, if I can contribute to some of that understanding, that would be a good thing. But again, there's so many kind of other experts out there, and there's a lot of good information being shared by the NIRS companies themselves, right? So again, of course, they're providing information relevant to their device and their company, but we can kind of apply those broad lessons and then compare it to whatever we're observing in ourselves or in our athletes, and kind of just the whole field is kind of in that almost, I don't know, maybe that early 1990s period of power meters in cycling. We're still writing that training Bible, so to speak. We're making it up as we go along, but we're starting to understand kind of what to expect.
Yeah, certainly. And to finish off, if you had to give some recommendations to someone that wants to start using NIRS as part of their training, what would your recommendations be on how to use it effectively for their sport? And that could be hybrid sport, cycling, any type of sport, because a lot of what you've described has been a combination with many different things. And I think that's absolutely great. So kind of like, if someone started using NIRS, what else do they need to do to really maximize that data?
I have to say, first of all, I am not convinced, that any gadget is necessary for every training session forever, right? I really think it can add data, and we can turn that data into information, but it's not necessary. And so we kind of have to pick and choose, what are we kind of prioritizing, what are we valuing, and we don't want to have kind of information overload or data overload. That being said, I think there's a model for NIRS to be used by a coach or a high performance center. And in my experience, and this is kind of how we've used it, if we can kind of start with a structured formal test, that's the incremental test, the ramp test, or maybe it's more of a functional test relevant to the task demands of the athlete, right? High rocks athlete, let's do some of those events in sequence, and let's see what the response looks like. So again, that standard test gives us a bit of that functional range, and just gives us a bit of familiarity, that first initial familiarization with the data. Then we give the sensor or sensors to that athlete. And the first lesson I would say is, first couple weeks, use it whenever you want to use it. Use it for some of those key sessions, whatever those key sessions are, whether it's more of kind of event simulation, or just it's your high intensity session for the week, that kind of thing. just observe it, see what it looks like. Again, start thinking in the back of your head about sensations, but don't make any changes yet. In the first few weeks, we're really just observing and trying to kind of make connections in our brain about what we're seeing. And with the coach's help, or the high performance center, I don't necessarily think that NIRS is something that an individual athlete needs to own. I think I have 4 sensors scattered around my home right now, but that's because I'm using it for research. And I kind of, I joke that I don't train anymore. I just pilot test things on myself. So I'm always kind of experimenting. But, and that's totally fine. Like if that's what an athlete wants to do and that just interests them and motivates them, awesome. Yeah. Go to town, have fun, get all the data you can and play with it. So I think the model is more of kind of almost a hub and spoke, where you have a hub of a coach or high performance center. They're distributing a couple sensors for a short period of time to their athletes. The athlete uses them, collects a bunch of data, looks at a bunch of different sessions, a couple weeks of just observational. Then you meet again with the coach or the specialist, review, see what you're looking at, see what you feel, right? Both of you kind of get the quantitative and the qualitative feedback on the same page. And then you start to apply it and say, okay, we saw you were deoxygenating really quick whenever you moved from a low extremity activity to an upper body extremity activity. And that's a very common trend. So let's try to balance out that pacing strategy. And we have to, pull back a little bit on the run so that you have more in the tank for the skier. And then you're playing with not only the sensations of how does that feel, right? Okay, I'm going 5% easier. It feels a heck of a lot easier. Now I can actually go 10% harder in the ski erg, and you can get the data to kind of feedback into that relationship. So I really think it's a slow, gradual process, but in chunks, let's say. So whether it's 2 weeks, a month at a time, and then you give the device back and you don't worry about it, and you apply the lessons that you learned based on the sensations and based on the qualitative feedback that you and your coach and your support team have learned. And then if we can retest and send a sensor back, or the athlete comes in to retest in the lab and do another incremental test after some period of training where they've worked on whatever those lessons are that we've taken from that first bout. We retest, we see, okay, right? I mean, are we going longer on our incremental test? Is our pace improved on the task demands? And we kind of just, rinse and repeat. So just like you would periodize your training with different blocks focused on different aspects of performance or physiology, right? You kind of bring in the NIRS device to just add another perspective, add another lamppost that we can look under to try to learn some lessons. So again, keeping it super broad, but hopefully that kind of gives a start for someone who's interested.
No, really nice. I think going broad is really good for someone that's starting, but also it makes it a bit more practical, and you can start to find your own way of using it, especially like you said, utilize it for a few weeks on certain hot sessions and then go away and do the training based on the lessons, come back. Sometimes I quite like testing all the time, not because I'm going to make loads of decisions from that data. It just, when you go back and review all of the data, it kind of tells a story. And then that story is that when you start making decisions.
Yeah.
But if then you're testing all the time and it starts to impact your training, then it's completely counterproductive. So there's always a healthy balance. So your recommendations, I find, really quite good.
If the testing just kind of shows different things every time you test with it, and you can't quite, it doesn't kind of make sense if there's not a consistent story to the data, right? That's that translation between data to information. There's potentially that risk where if we use it in a targeted way, and so again, I hesitate because I'm making it sound like it's not approachable. And I don't necessarily think that. Again, I think if you as an individual athlete are interested in these gadgets and the devices and looking at the data, I think that's great. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be taken. It doesn't have to be overwhelming, but I think certainly there can be more specific takeaways and interpretations and lesson learns with the help of some kind of an expert, coach, physiologist, clinician, whatever it is.
Jem, that was absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. I love talking about your research, especially your PhD, and it was great to have the recording on the same day when one of your papers got accepted. I think that's brilliant. If anyone wants to reach you and has any questions, where can they find all your content?
Yeah. Social media, I'm probably most active on Twitter/X, and I think it's just my name, JEM_Arnold. My academic email is open and out there, and it's the same, jem.arnold@ubc.ca. And then I have a blog that I used to write on more often and now doesn't get as much attention, but that's sparecycles.blog. So any of those ways of getting a hold of me, again, I'm happy to kind of respond to DMs or emails. Certainly to kind of plug the clinical side of things, right? If there are athletes who are just listening to the description of FLIA, of endofibrosis, and just thinking about, that kind of, that's ticking a couple boxes in my own condition, please reach out. I'm happy to help wherever in the world that you are. We can kind of direct you to local resources.
Brilliant. We'll put all of that in our show notes, especially regarding reaching out, regarding FLIA. And I just want to also say how much I enjoyed your blog, Spare Cycles. Like I've got a few more to read through, but I think they're absolutely brilliant. And they've been, I've got them up on my iPad and I read them just before bed. I think they've been brilliant. And I really recommend anyone listening to go check them out.
It's a lot of stream of consciousness, but yeah,
they're the best ones. You
Thanks,
just consciousness into writing. So
yeah, that's what a blog is for. It's just like a podcast. We're just able to chat. A blog is just to write down ideas. Save the really well-researched, structured stuff for the academic manuscripts.
Exactly. Thank you so much.